Good day, friends. Welcome to another Gords Poetry Show. And today, in this sunny, warm morning in June in Oakville, I'm interviewing Catherine Black, poet, teacher, and maybe something else as well.
Chair of Creative Writing Program at OCAD University.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I knew I'd forgotten something.
Yeah.
So Catherine's been telling me she and Lillian Allen are putting together and initiating a creative writing program at OCAD in Toronto. And I'm intrigued because many artists in the modern tradition, I guess even going back to Leonardo da Vinci, were interesting, fascinating note takers and writers. So I'm suspecting you're going to get a lot of people that can not only paint and draw, but write as well.
Absolutely. So we've had enormous interest in the program, and
Yes.
and the privilege of seeing the work that's coming in from this diverse range of students. You know, there are students who are working in graphic novel, there are students
yes,
who
right.
are producing comics or image and text work. We have people who have produced writing for stage, for performance, slam poets. You know, so we're not just seeing people writing on the page, but we're seeing that real crossover. Students who have ambitions to, you know, see their writing, you know, work with video and work with other media and sort of in an interdisciplinary, a transdisciplinary way to see how they can bring their words to life. So it's fantastic to see the types of students we're attracting, and we have a strong cohort for our first year.
Great.
We're starting up in September, and it's a really interesting program. So we have built into the program, we have connections to our publication streams. So students are taking nano publishing, they're taking other courses in editorial through publications as well, and we have connections to our INVC program, which is Indigenous Visual Culture. So as we approach the study of literature, we're considering first and foremost Indigenous and First Nations writers and literature and living literature as a starting point for our discussions, which is really kind of inverting the way that a lot of creative writing programs and English programs have been in the past, which is to say, we start with the canon. First you study British literature, and then we're saying, well, no, we're studying the living literature, the literature that is here and that is now and is foundational to who we are as writers. And you know, you can study American literature, you can study Canadian literature as you move on, but let's start here. Let's start with literature of the diaspora. Let's start with Indigenous literature as well. Anyway, so those are some of the features. Of
Sounds exciting and innovative.
It is exciting. It is exciting.
Great.
Yeah. And I think just to add to that, what also excites me is that we're not simply looking for students coming, you know, we're excited to welcome students straight out of high school, but we're not just looking for those students. We're really trying to offer a place for students who might not ordinarily see themselves in academia, who might, or in the academy, right? So people who have been out of school for a while, maybe have a practice, or maybe performing, you know, twice a week somewhere, or maybe doing slams or doing these different things, to say, we want you, like, come to us, and this is a different kind of home for your writing.
I see.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we certainly look forward to seeing how all that pans out in the coming year. I'll be interested to talk to you again and, you know, see how that's been coming along. And did you do any creative writing programs elsewhere before this?
Did I teach in creative writing programs? No, I didn't. I came from you know, my schooling, and then I worked as a freelance writer for a while. I worked briefly at an advertising agency, and then I went straight into teaching.
I see.
Yeah.
And did you teach literature?
I began by teaching first year composition. So I taught ESL, I taught rhetoric, and mechanics in writing, and then, you know, slowly began to teach some of the creative writing courses.
When you say the word rhetoric, I'm reminded of I wouldn't call it an obsession, but something I notice a lot in contemporary poetry. There's a lot of rhetoric gets into the lyric, and I'm okay with it
How do
to
you mean,
some
Gord?
degree. Well, rhetoric, I mean, somebody's arguing a political point,
Mm-hmm.
an economic point, an ethical point,
Mm-hmm.
a racial, when I say racial, talking about the rivalries and enmities between the races in
Okay.
Canada. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that,
Mm.
but sometimes I feel there's a little too much of it, and poets can forget that I think our first duty is to write with beauty and grace. And, well, of course, definitions of beauty and grace vary over the centuries. I get that. But, and I've written plenty of rhetorical poetry myself, angry political poetry, but I see a lot of it. And I just think of, Aristotle and those guys, and they talk about rhetoric and lyric and dramatic, and it's just the different forms. And it's just a perception of mine. And perhaps you'd care to comment. Am I being too critical? Am I being too picky when I say that?
No, I mean I appreciate your opinion. I mean, I think I think people are coming to voice in a lot of different ways these days, and I think that I wouldn't want to undermine. And in fact, I kind of champion poets who do come to voice and see poetry as a tool for change.
Yes, yes.
And I think I think poetry is incredibly important. And while I don't, I think the craft is equally important. Maybe that's what you're responding to is
there's
that
not enough
that
attention to craft.
the attention to craft and the substance and the possibility of writing and poetry in particular as being something that expresses not only lived experience but also can affect change in society and change people's perceptions and minds and open up their experiences. So
yes.
I mean, I think it's all important, and I think of course it needs to be done well.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah, I think that kind of excites me actually to see to see the poetry going in this direction. It does excite me because I think it's something that young people in particular can latch on to, and particularly those who feel disenfranchised in some way.
Yes. Yes.
So that's a way in. It's a way in, and it's a way to be heard, and it's a way to be recognized, and
Yeah, well, it certainly is, and I see lots of it. A lot of it comes into the library, and I've read some of it on PoetryShow. People that are arguing various viewpoints from their maybe under the mainstream, and they feel like they want to pop their heads up into the mainstream and be part of it, and have the perception that they're being pushed back or rejected or ignored or whatever. And you can see that or at least I feel I can see that they are not actually being any of those things, because as perhaps you might agree, being white and middle class and speaking English is no guarantee of mainstream success. You're still a poet publishing a book to a small number of people and reading it small readings. You're not suddenly embraced. And this perception, I feel, of, how shall I put it, minority groups or ethnic minorities. Maybe they have a harder time, but I think as we need to have their experience, they need to have ours, because they don't quite know what it is.
I disagree.
Do you?
I do.
Okay.
I disagree. I feel that no matter what, I'll just speak for myself. I'm operating from a place of privilege.
Yes.
Right? So everything I do, arriving here today has been a result of a certain amount of privilege.
I see.
Having the job that I do, being in the position that I'm in, right?
Right.
So, and I think I do disagree. I think that my job right now is to make space for people who have not had
Yes.
space before.
Yes.
And who and I think there needs to be a sort of leveling of things, which means that there are times that I need to be silent, and there are times that I need to step down, and there are people that I need to recognize and champion.
Yes.
And I think it's time for that. For me, I mean, I think that I don't agree that people who are from a position of or who are from a minority group need to know my experience. I think that they've only known my experience for so long and haven't seen their own experiences represented in literature adequately.
Yes.
That now's the time.
I see.
Really do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, obviously it's open for discussion, the whole
sure.
thing, and I'm certainly not going to insist on my viewpoint. I just wanted to, bring it up.
No, I'm glad. It's an important conversation.
I'm trying to think of people from, what shall we say, minority cultures or ethnicities or backgrounds that I might have read 40 and 50 years ago. And I know James Baldwin was fairly successful. I arrived in North America at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, so and it was bursting open, and the anti-Vietnam thing, and so I read a fair bit of that. And those people felt
Renaissance, and
they were felt oppressed, and needed to have a voice, and then with post Stonewall, the gay literature, and exploring that, trying to find what I could find. Early books by writers that were later famous, and published by very small presses in Florida, gosh knows where, and just exposing myself to. I'm thinking of the lady who became famous, Patricia Highsmith.
Right.
Detective fiction, and they recently filmed her first novel, and about married gay women in New York area in the early 50s. The novel was called The Price of Salt, and it was turned into quite a good film, and it really portrayed the challenges and oppression that these women would face, losing their children in custody battles, all that sort of a thing. And so I did try to sort of expose myself to that as the years went on, and you realized, there's this kind of literature and there's that kind, and there's people from Morocco writing, or people from wherever it would get translated, maybe New Directions, or the more prominent sort of alternative presses, and so it was always something of great interest to me, and I don't wish to sort of portray this sense of being superior or ignoring it or sidelining it or whatever. So maybe it's a factor of age. Maybe I've been doing it a little too long, but I'm certainly not in any way resentful or feeling like us poor white people are being shoved off to the corner. I don't feel that way at all. But it certainly is fascinating to. Just as we in the major cities in the West, I would say probably anywhere, like Toronto or New York or San Francisco or London, the incredible conversions of cultures.
We're so lucky.
And it's just absolutely fascinating.
We,
both Catherine and I live in Oakville, and you might think it's a little, posh little white bread community, but I can assure you, you walk down that downtown park on a weekend, and you barely hear English at all. You hear many Eastern European languages, many Asian languages, to the point where, is that Korean? Is that Slovenian? That's the world we live in. And it's certainly, Southern Ontario wasn't like that when I was a young man in the 70s. So it's been quite fascinating to
see the change.
To see the change, quite fascinating. So, and to see it in literature is also great. No question in my mind. So I was wondering if maybe you'd like to talk about how you got started in writing.
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Cool.
absolutely.
Because you're definitely from a different generation than me, so I'd be fascinated to hear how and when you plugged in.
Okay. I think, well, I always wrote, but, I wrote through high school and, but really plugged in Montreal when I was an undergrad at McGill University. And I was taking English literature, but I felt very strongly. I think if I had been braver, I would have taken a creative writing degree.
Oh yes.
So I really fell in love with writing. Probably around the time I was 18, I decided that's what I want to do. And so I took some courses with at Concordia University in the creative writing program as well.
Yes.
And so simultaneously, and really just started getting into reading every poet I could encounter. And I mean, I guess that's why I also bring up this issue of reading sort of widely and deeply.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Because I think in the 90s,
Yes.
enough respect to McGill, but we were still reading a lot of dead white guys. Which was great. I mean, it was good. It was a start, whatever. But we started reading, I think when I started reading and these, Klein Leighton Cohen. I remember there was a course in Klein Leighton and Cohen, and I thought, wow, these people were actually in Montreal, and it started to feel like poetry was something that was living and breathing.
Yes, yes.
And then, taking, at the time it was called Native Canadian literature, and reading some of the Indigenous poets and thinking like, oh my God, there's so much that I don't know. And feeling really sort of infused. It was an effervescent time.
Yes.
And
yes.
And then also the excitement of having writing groups within the university. So I became involved in that and sending my stuff out to literary journals, which I didn't even know existed.
Yes.
And so Scrivener and Montage and Pillar and these kind of university literary journals, and it felt thrilling. It felt really, really thrilling to be connected with a community in a university and doing some writing in that way. So that's how I really committed to writing, and then I took some time off after university and moved to Mexico for a while, and decided there, okay, I'm going to really commit to this and do a graduate degree in writing.
Yes.
So I went to Chicago. I went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Because I didn't want to pick genres. I'm a poet. I began as a poet, but I also write long fiction, and I write creative nonfiction.
Yes.
And I, had some experience working in bronze and some silversmithing, and
I see.
so some of those. And
Right.
I wanted a program that I could move around in and not be, limited to being, a poet or someone who writes fiction.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so I did a degree there, and
Nice. And any
continued
interesting
on my merry
teachers?
way. Yeah, actually, oh yes. So the best reader I've ever had, which to me in many ways translates as the best teacher, is Mary Cross.
Mary Cross.
Yes. Rooms Who Were People, and she's a poet, and she's a generous reader. Do you know? She's a reader who, when you sit with her, she asks all the right questions.
Oh.
And I think
Great.
what's wonderful about Mary is that she taught me to be curious with other people's writing. So, what's this about? Well, where does this go? And then what happens? And how does she know that? And, asking all of these questions. So it was like, it gets you thinking about it in a way that is like completely unexpected. So it was Mary Cross. I worked with Calvin Forbes, who wrote the Shine poems. He's retired now, and he was fantastic. He was one of my thesis advisors.
Yes.
I worked with Elise Passion, who is Poetry Society. I think she started Poetry in Motion in Chicago as well,
yes.
which is the poetry within the subways. And,
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and she, her thesis advisor was Seamus Heaney, actually.
Oh, well.
Which was pretty cool. Pretty cool. Well,
You bet.
Yeah. And really. And who else did I work with? Matthew Goolish, Sarah Levine, Ben Ramke. Oh, God. Dan Beachy-Quick, who is amazing. He's a wonderful he was, at the time, he was like a young up and coming poet, but he of course took the world by storm. I think he's in Colorado now.
Oh, yes.
And so that was fantastic. And then in my cohort, of course, were some amazing writers.
Yes.
And one writer sort of significance from that cohort is Danielle Dutton, who she started Dorothy, a publishing project.
Oh, yeah.
And she's producing some incredible texts. I would really recommend checking out Dorothy. Just unbelievably innovative and cutting edge literature with a feminist bent. Yeah. And I know Type Books in Toronto carries Dorothy as well, so check it out. There's my little plug for...
Okay, I'll do that. I finally remembered the small press that published early books by Jane Rule, Claes Press.
Claes?
C-L-E-I-S, Claes Press.
Claes Press.
And it was around the time when she was becoming quite known for her novel, The Young in One Another's Arms, and almost mainstream, but I found this old, maybe not her first book, but very early on, and it was very much a starting out kind of book.
Yeah.
And if the Mississauga Library hadn't had it on the shelf, I probably never would have seen it anywhere.
Right.
So anyway, just to, I mentioned it before and couldn't remember the name.
Oh, I love
that was
it.
the one. And because I lived through, 69, 70, 71, and that first tidal wave of feminism, both political feminism and literary feminism, and was fascinated with it, absolutely fascinated, because it's such a cultural shift, such a cultural shift. And I remember the only reason I got to interview Margaret Drabble 20 years ago was because I said to Augustine, having coffee one morning, we got yakking about something, and that's when she was editing books in Canada, and I was writing for about a very early Margaret Drabble novel set in 1962, when a young couple post-college meet at a party and have a little bit of fleeting sexuality, and the woman gets pregnant and doesn't know what to do, and B, doesn't tell the boyfriend or the temporary boyfriend or whatever,
Right.
and finds herself having a medical procedure to end the and this is 1962 Britain, when none of the, was it even legal? I don't even know. But the naivety of it, they're both incredibly naive. Neither of them have a clue about how pregnancy seems to happen. They don't seem to know what to do about it.
Right.
She's too shy to even tell him. She's not angry because nothing has taught her to be angry, and she feels a bit silly, and all that sort of a thing. And
what was this book?
I think it's called The Summer Birdcage. It's one of the first two. Drabble's been writing so long. She goes from about 1960 up to, and she's still working now. And you can get the early novels in Penguin paperbacks. Right. And it's just like that old Philip Larkin poem about sex begins in 1963, before the first Beatles LP and all that sort of a thing.
Right.
It's very much that time period, which I remember as like a 9-year-old. How do you remember that? You don't remember it when you're 9. You just were there.
Yes.
And but it's such a, and then that was, Olga said, why don't you interview Margaret Drabble? So I did. So it was a wonderful thing for me to do. Fantastic. But it was a very casual remark, because Olga's significantly younger than me, and I said, hey, you should, we got talking about those issues, and I said, here's something you might be interested in, just as the way writers talk to each other. And it's that whole sense of, in the world that we live in, you and I, yakking to somebody, casual remarks lead to something else.
Isn't that cool? Following the literary breadcrumbs. Right?
Yes, it's great fun.
Yeah.
And it just, when we're talking about the, as I say, tidal wave of feminism, I mean, I can remember opening the Toronto Star. I'd only been in Canada a year, and there's a picture of all these bras burning on a New York street. Yeah. And I'm like 18.
Right.
Whoa, look at that. Those days.
Yes.
And then, of course, the book started to come out, and Betty Dodson's book, you read about it, and somebody else's book. Could you find it anywhere? No.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, the one, the hand-drawn pictures of the genitalia.
Yeah.
I found the reprint 20 years later, but the original edition, forget. You never find that. And I mean, it was, I think booksellers was too scared to put it on the shelf.
Sure they would.
They
would have been.
So those are some of my memories. You know, and then starting to realize that, you know, you go back to Anais Nin, I hope I'm saying her name right, and Henry Miller's really good friend, and she's highly sexual and highly sensual, and you think, well, how would she have reacted to feminism? You wonder, you know, maybe she lived long enough to go through it, but I was reading her early stuff, you know, and you see how that all sort of developed, you know, from those very early roots. So it was a fascinating time to live through.
What a
it
time.
was something. It really was.
Yeah.
And on all the political stuff too, coming from the States particularly, you know, the anti-Vietnam stuff and the civil rights stuff. It was very powerful.
So you were from Scotland to
Canada in
States?
'68.
Oh, Canada in 68. Okay.
But I mean, we
see.
were the usual swamping of American culture in Canada. You know, you just couldn't avoid it.
Yes.
The famous novelists of the day were Vonnegut and Brodigan and Roth and then I mean, I'm just rhyming off names very quickly here. You'd walk into a bookstore and that's what you'd see.
What was
Updike and you know, and the famous American writers.
When did you start to feel that there was a Canadian literary culture?
Oh, I noticed it right away.
Okay.
It was there, but it wasn't prominent, as anyone will tell you.
When did it start to feel like it was getting recognized?
Well, I got here in '68, and I was high school, so I was out in the suburbs. So it took me like 6 months to get downtown and actually walk around the bookstores and find where they were. But the school library, you know, my school library had, you know, what you'd expect, you know, Klein and Leighton, and P.K. Page and lady that wrote the Margaret Davison wrote the Dumbfounding.
There were Margaret Lawrence and
plenty of Margaret Lawrence, of course, plenty of Margaret Lawrence. She was prominent. I would say she was the mother of Canadian literature before Margaret Atwood came along. And a few people have argued, and you may or may not agree, that Canadian literature has always been a matriarchy.
Yeah, interesting.
And using Margaret Lawrence as a prime example.
That's interesting.
And one of my favorite reviewing book memories is the letters between Margaret Lawrence and Alice Munro.
Oh.
There's a few of those. Alice would go visit her when Margaret was famous and she wasn't. And this all came out later when Margaret, we found out that Margaret liked to, she'd offer you the water and she'd have the water, but that water would actually be a tumbler of gin.
Yes.
Yeah, we found that out later. So there's some fascinating little things in there.
That's its own literary tradition.
Yes. So, and, you know, remembering Margaret Lawrence novels getting banned by school boards. You know, I remember that very well.
Oh.
And not everywhere, but here and there.
Yeah.
You can't read this, you can't read that, you know. So I did live through all that. And it was interesting. It was fun. It was fascinating. And
that's a great literary upbringing. It is.
Well, thank you.
Or coming of age, right? Like
yes,
whatever.
Yes. And I mean, Atwood was starting to get established very quickly. Alice Munro, you know, I remember hearing somebody reading an entire Alice Munro novel, Lives of Girls and Women, on CBC Radio as I was doing my driving job. I heard the whole thing. It was quite fascinating. And, you know, that sense of a blooming talent, or a whole generation of blooming talents, was very much present in the 70s.
You mentioned P.K. Page.
Yes.
And that is meeting P.K. Page was the only time in my life that I have been starstruck. Wow.
Cool. I get it. I get starstruck reading the poetry.
Yeah, exactly. And she was at U of T and doing a reading, and you know, well into her old age, and my husband was with me, and he's very gregarious and confident, and I just become a little bit introverted in those moments, and you know, waiting for her to sign my anthology that I had from my undergraduate days, and I just said nothing to her. Just said nothing, and he was able to talk to her about her experiences living in Mexico City, and they were gabbing, and I was just standing there thinking, thank God he's saying something. Thank God I get to hear her speak casually, and well, it's not to me, but you know, she was fantastic.
Really?
She was,
wonderful.
Yes,
Yeah, again, I think somebody I first discovered through the school library, and then, you know, started to buy some of the later books as they came out. And she was always a presence. So a book would come out every few years, and you'd never, you know, sort of really able to forget her.
No.
Not prominent, but always there.
Always. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
And wonderful. I still love to read her poetry now. It hasn't faded for me in any way.
I do too. Those early ones for me, P.K. Page and Patrick Lane was a big one for me.
Yes.
In the Canadian, like the early days, like the undergraduate.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, for sure, Pat Lane.
I remember discovering the Coach House books of Jean McKay.
Mm-hmm.
There's some of Dragonfly Fling. Loved that book. Still do.
Oh, and Gwen McEwen.
Of course, Gwen McEwen.
Right?
She was like already a star from the 50s, I think.
Yeah.
And she was like very established in the poetry world, and you came to her like you might come to Leighton or Bowring maybe. And definitely belonging to that generation.
Yes.
And seeing her uniqueness, her lyrical uniqueness, her not seeming to have any debt to any other Canadian poets that I could see.
That's interesting. Yeah,
you know?
I think that's pretty
I'm not
accurate.
sure where her roots are. I'm sure others have studied it,
Yeah.
as people always do. But at the time, she was quite a surprisingly lyrical voice to me, as was New Love. John Newlove.
Yeah.
Discovered him around that time.
And then, those radical departures like the B.P. Nickel.
Oh, yes.
And like just saying, oh my God, what, the excitement of what those experimentations can bring to Canadian.
Oh, yes. Those
poetry.
early Coach House books
Yes,
were.
they're
I've got
wonderful.
a B.P. Nickel book. It's all purple.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And part of the martyrology. And discovering it and like, oh, what is this all about?
You're allowed to do this?
Yeah. Yeah, you can do this and get away with it? Great.
Yeah. I love that. I love those. And you know what? I still encounter poets today that I'm like, you're allowed to? Like,
Yeah.
I'm allowed to? We can do this? And
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
I love that feeling.
Uh-huh.
I felt that way. I felt that way encountering prose poetry, for sure.
Yes.
Like there was a permission granted that it didn't have to be lined in a specific way.
Oh, right.
Right?
Yes.
That like we can do this. This
Yes.
is
Yes.
this is permissible. Like who do we ask?
I remember at a friend's place in Chicago, again, many years ago, discovering Carl Sandburg's collected poems, and there are some prose poems there. And there I immediately saw where Richard Brodigan was coming from. This is early 70s when everyone was obsessed with Richard Brodigan. He was very famous. And reading the Sandburg done in the 20s, and there's these little blocky little prose poems, and you can see Brodigan's really influenced by them. There's no question. And I went, oh my goodness, because you think Sandburg's very sort of stodgy and old-fashioned, and writing about Lincoln and all this kind of stuff. But actually, his poetry is quite contemporary. A lot of it.
Yeah.
And I just had to be confronted with the collected poems, shoved in my mitts, and say, have a look at this, to realize it. So prose poetry, yeah. Gertrude Stein's Gnarly Buttons. That's a good one. That's been re-released.
Right.
Read that on PoetryShow. Again, it's all prose poetry.
Yeah.
I think I found it. Oh, I've got it in an anthology called Great American Prose Poems or something. And there's also a selection from Gnarly Buttons. And I kept thinking, Gnarly Buttons is an interesting sort of title.
Right.
Not Smooth Buttons, Gnarly Buttons.
Yeah.
Let's see how we're doing time-wise here, Catherine. No, we're doing okay. He moves the screen to read the time.
Nice.
Well, you would
Come
too
back
if
on
it
the
was as
screen.
sunny here. Can hardly see a darn thing. Oh, sorry, are you off? Are you
no,
okay there?
I want you to be on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it tells me we've got about another 10 minutes or so.
Nice.
We'll see if that works.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sounds great.
I'm wondering if you'd like to read a poem or two.
I'd love to.
A new one, an old one, any poem that catches your fancy.
Sure. Yeah. Why don't I read? Will be good, I think, to read from my new book.
Sure. Absolutely. Oh, the one with the nifty cover.
Yes. I'll hold up
Yes.
the nifty cover.
Yeah, see if the,
See if you can see
the-
that.
Yeah, you might. The sun might block it out. It's hard to say.
So it's this cover actually was a print by an OCAD student.
Yes.
And while I was writing the book, there was a print sale in the lobby at OCAD.
Cool.
And I saw it, and I asked her the title, and it was called Floating Suburbia. Perfect. I bought the print and got her card and thought, Marley Jennings, I'm coming back to you, and I'm going to see if I can use this as. So Guernica was kind enough to.
Yeah, so very nice. I like that.
Isn't
the
it
colours.
wonderful?
Yeah.
It just has the same sort of whimsy and awe that I tried to speak to in the poems.
I see.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It definitely has the whimsy.
Yes. So why don't I read something in keeping with our
Sure.
discussions, maybe?
I just saw one called The Deer in the Dictionary.
Oh, The Deer in the Dictionary.
It just caught me as it was
It's
floating
very short.
by.
I'll read it right now.
Okay,
It's very
go.
short. The Deer and the Dictionary. All of nature stepping circles around itself on spindly fawn legs, tamped down the ground with hooves and too many adjectives.
Good. I
Thanks.
like that. Too many adjectives. We're all prone to that.
Let's see what we can... I will read, I'll read this. I like reading this one, so I'm going to read it, if that's okay.
Sure.
This is Contraposto Royal Ontario Museum. I leave my students in a carapace of crystal in an enameled box under the alabaster scarab wing. They blink in their perfect languages of signs and symbols. I lose them near the Rosetta Stone reproduction by the painted sarcophagus, and they emerge in suits of armor. They emerge in snake scales and stand in contrapposto, drinking from goblets of hammered gold. I leave my students in the slotted archives, in the felt-lined drawers, in the cracks of the amphora. They emerge in the palm of the archivist, small as clay beads, small as butterfly pins. They have all been numbered. I lose my students in the cafeteria lineup, in the oversized elevator, in the mouth of the flying frog, by a lake that no longer exists. They emerge in shoes of lava, from the belly of the mudwoman, from the long sleep inside the anaconda, from the diorama of the forest, where animals stare in perpetual alarm.
Yes, I like that one.
Thank you. So that's from Bewilderness.
Yes, I like the. I remember. I think you read it at the reading I was
Yes.
at in Burlington.
Yes.
And carapace.
Yes.
It's a wonderful word,
Oh,
carapace.
thanks.
I love it.
So I'm working on I finished another book of prose poetry.
Oh, yes.
And it's currently under consideration with
Yes.
a small press.
Uh-huh.
And it's something I'm really excited about. It's called, working title is Mother Winter Love. And
Uh-huh.
it's prose poetry or short flash lyric nonfiction. It's one of those kind of hybrid forms that deals with issues of motherhood and mental health.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's the experience of, the first section is this experience of being pregnant and have all the, sort of attendant anxieties and
Yes.
hopes and
Yes.
aspirations and
Yes.
all of, and the second section is around birth and postpartum, and it takes place in a very sort of crackly winter of deep anxiety and deep depression, and then the last section is sort of a reconsideration of what it means to be a mother, and an imperfect mother, but a mother who is living with mental health and just sort of a re-envisioning of motherhood.
Yeah. Well, you've got me intrigued. Can
Oh,
we hear
good.
some of it?
Yes, I would love that. I would love it.
Great.
So I think I'll read the first poem, which is called Quiet House. House, a spinning of cells, a thrumming of poppy seed ventricles, and the meditation of a pink mind. It stares blackly within, in some velvet-lined chamber fashioned from bolts of fabric, thumbtacks. We've yet to speak. Still, I fear an awful ending to this mutual but comfortable silence. I stare inward at black eyes and wonder about the moment of ignition, a tiny match flare in the velvet-lined room, a plucking of stars, a pinch of flint between fingertips. New blood circulates new circuitry, and I'm rendered mute against the sound of it. Body new, body a home to hold two heartbeats. So
Nice.
some of the
Nice.
as
Like
it
that.
thank you, as it progresses, it's the language became a lot more. My experience of language during postpartum and during depression became a lot more fractured, and it was an incredibly difficult time. But it was also a time where I could watch with fascination what happened to my capacity for expression, and it was really weird. It felt like words were falling away. It felt like I had new words. It felt like my syntax was jumbled. And so I tried to reflect a lot of that in sort of the middle section of the book.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm very curious now.
Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah.
The whole the joy of motherhood beset by the anxieties of mental instability.
Yeah.
Sounds fascinating.
And the fact that those can coexist, right? And so often do. And it's not something that we're terribly comfortable talking about, because it means that we're in some way flawed, which is inaccurate, of course, right?
Of course. Is this the myth of Superwoman that I
Right.
saw arise in the 70s and 80s?
Yeah.
And that was, what a terrible, destructive myth that was.
Right.
My
Absolutely.
God. The number of career women that I ran into, just as friends,
Yes.
who were just obviously, oh my God, stressed out to the max.
Yeah, the expectations are
Falling to
unreal.
bits and just hanging together, drinking way too much coffee.
Yeah.
That sort of a thing. You felt terribly. I mean, you realized they were breaking away from being the mothers and the dinner cookers and house cleaners of the 50s and early 60s that I saw as a boy. You realize
Right.
that movement had to go away. No, don't put it
Oh,
away. I
okay,
want you to
okay.
read. I want you to read.
Okay,
But I'm
okay.
just getting, you're getting me worked up. But remembering all this
Right.
stuff. And you realize it had to happen culturally
It did.
and morally and spiritually. But the struggle was intense.
Right.
Incredibly intense.
Right, and there was no support. There was nothing in place to.
Yeah.
Yes, and not a lot of. There was, any kind of need or vulnerability was seen as a weakness, and you know what I mean. Like it was
Yeah.
a dangerous thing to talk about. Not
Yes.
feeling anything but perfect
Yes.
or strong. Yeah.
Oh no! And there was memories. You'd read stuff about women in the 50s that had mental instability, and they'd wind up in a psychiatric institution, and the kids would be taken away.
Absolutely.
And, oh my God! And they'd go to McGill and get acid from Ewan Cameron.
You know what,
and bet
Gord?
even
I would
worse.
have been there.
I know.
Honest to God, if that were
Yeah.
my era, that's where I would have been. I would have been locked up.
So
for sure.
you realize the terrible tragedy of that and the misunderstanding of it. And then here we are in the late 70s, early 80s, and women have more strength, but they have much more, a much higher hill to climb. And it was a very fascinating period to live through. So please, read some more
I will. I'll read something
before we run out of time.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we got a few more minutes.
Okay.
Fire away.
Let's see what I can find here.
Because certainly the contrasting themes are fascinating to me.
Thank you. So this is River's Gravity. Just a couple of cold words. Think about the geese in their commuter routes over the smoky skies. Think of the fire pop and the child asking, "What's that noise?" Think of the rattle of brass keys on a ring, the baby turning his head back and forth against the cold sheet, asking for sleep. Think of your madness beside the small, cold river. That thing snakes so blackly, so beautifully through bald land. A farmer's gate rusted open, the wires snipped. I drive north with the children on the doeskin edges of sleep. North of here are stubbled fields and ramshackle mansions, a sign for honey and homemade bacon. Don't worry about the falling off words. They return when the breast milk dries up, I'm told, and the hormones lay their little brass weights on another balancing plate.
I like that.
Thank you.
Rhythmically.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
I hope we see that book published fairly soon.
Thanks. I feel very proud of it, you know?
I bet you do.
I do.
Even
like
from the
that
little that I
poem.
heard, I can see
Thanks.
you're articulating your vision.
Thank you. It came forth in sort of it came forth as a book, which not all my books do. So it was really a nice experience to write it, although intense.
Yes.
But yeah, I feel very connected to that book.
I see.
Yeah. Thanks, Gord, for giving me the chance to read something and
Oh, you're welcome, dear. Absolutely.
this opportunity to talk with you.
Great fun. And I'm sure we'll do another one in the months ahead.
That'd be lovely. I'd
Because,
love
I mean,
that.
for several reasons, not the least of which is hearing about the first year of the creative writing program at
Oh,
OCAD.
thank you. Yeah.
As I say, every time we talk about it, my mind flashes on those journals of Leonardo da Vinci and all the interesting stuff that he scribbled down the side while he was
Isn't that the
imagining
best?
helicopters and God knows what else.
Marginalia is
Yeah.
writing, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
it's, absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure.
Gary Barwin and I got talking about that recently on Facebook, and he reminded me of discovering some of Joyce's scribbles in journals published by University Press. I found it at Erindale College Library in the mid to late 70s. It's called Scribbledy Hobble,
Really?
and it's like all the stuff that didn't get into Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses, and it's just wild.
That's fantastic.
It's just endless, like sort of Joycean wordplay. And it just goes on and on and on, page after page after page. And this is the stuff that didn't get in, and it's like vastly entertaining. And that
I love the
might
title.
be called, I know.
Yeah.
And it's probably a quote. I mean, it's a long while since I've seen it.
Right.
And like many books by university presses, they disappear and you can't
Yes.
find them anywhere. I
Yeah.
can't. Who published it? I can't remember.
Right.
But I thought I was always going to be living half a mile from Ellendale College.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not, but I was then. And so the marginalia stuff, fascinating. I mean, the novel that Dylan Thomas wrote with John Davenport, One Drunken Weekend in Wales, The Death of the King's Canary. They threw together an entire novel in a weekend, apparently. And you can buy it. I think you can get a Penguin edition. It's pretty funny.
I haven't read it.
I
That's-
read it
yeah.
years ago and I thought, well, that's a good laugh.
Yeah.
And then you think of them being like pissed and writing the whole thing.
Wasted and, and writing over the weekend.
And everyone else is down playing cards somewhere else, As poets, we know all these funny stories, right?
Yeah.
And the marginalia stories are some of the most interesting, no question. The stuff that didn't get into a book or a manuscript, my God, it just goes on forever. Let's have a look at the time here. We're 46, 44. I'd say we're getting on there. You can never quite tell when it's going to finish. It's got a mind of its own.
Right.
It's okay, that's
It just
enough. It goes.
decides.
We're done.
Cut.
And it says 55, but it rarely goes to 55.
Right.
But as perhaps you noticed with your poetry reading that we were the Burlington one, somehow it went into two parts. There's like 35 minutes and then
that's
there's
right.
8 minutes or something.
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
couldn't even tell you how